In Middle Ages Europe, getting a divorce was next to impossible, and the only way out of a marriage was the death of a spouse or annulment. A woman who sought annulment often had to bring a case based on her man's inability to perform his duties in bed. That often involved an awkward public examination in court, in which the husband would have to demonstrate that he could get an erection. Alternatively, the estranged couple could settle matters by fighting a divorce duel. Below are 20 things about that and other fascinating but lesser-known Middle Ages facts. Getting out of a marriage was really hard in the Middle Ages. In pre-modern times, a divorce was frowned upon to such an extent that it was just about impossible to secure one. King Henry VIII, for example, spent years trying to get the Pope to annul his marriage. When that failed, he took England out of the Catholic fold, started his own Church of England with himself at its head, and got out of his marriage that way. For those who were not kings, things could be even trickier. They were especially tricky for women. In France, for example, just about the only legal grounds to get out of a marriage was if a hubby couldn't get it up. To defend themselves from charges of impotence, defendant husbands would have to demonstrate that they could get an erection in a courtroom in front of witnesses and legal experts, to the satisfaction of honest women appointed by the authorities to check. Yeah, no pressure or anything. However, there was an alternative to making a husband prove his virility in public by expelling reproductive fluids on demand. The couple could instead fight a divorce duel. Such bouts were common enough to warrant an entire chapter in a popular Middle Ages dueling manual. Divorce duels were not to the death, but death was the ultimate outcome. In 1467, Hans Talhofer, a German combat instructor and court advisor in regard to judicial duels, wrote Fichtbuch, fencing book. The illustrated tome included techniques for couples who wanted out of the marriage and wanted to settle things via a divorce duel. Since men have obvious physical advantages, efforts were made to even things out. Husbands armed with 3 clubs had to fight from inside a waist-high hole about 3 feet wide, with one hand tied to their body. Wives were armed with 3 rocks that weighed up to 5 pounds, tied in a cloth like a battery in a sock, and could move around the hole freely. Both sides' weapons had to be of equal length. If hubby touched the edge of the hole, he forfeited a club, and if he did so 3 times, he would have to continue unarmed. If that happened, he would presumably have to try and wrestle her into the hole before she bashed his head in. Talhofer's manual offered advice about appropriate clothes, test techniques for each gender, and step-by-step instructions to exploit the opponent's vulnerabilities. The duels were surprisingly fair, and there are numerous accounts of women coming out victors. Although middle-aged divorce duels were not to the death, death was the ultimate result. If the wife won, her husband was executed, and if the husband won, the wife was buried alive. Middle Ages Europe was not entirely Christian and white. Most Europeans in the Middle Ages were Christian and white, but not all. Various parts of Europe had significant populations of Jews, Muslims, and even pagans. Their numbers varied from region to region depending on its history and culture. Throughout most of the era, Jews could be found in all parts of Europe. Muslims were common at times. Even a majority in the Iberian Peninsula had a significant presence in Sicily, and could be found in many ports and trade centers up north in Prussia, Scandinavia, and the Baltics. Pagans predominated. The greatest dividing line in Europe was religion, not race. Indeed, race back then was not defined the way it is now, so white or black mattered less in the Middle Ages than did one's religion. For example, a swarthy or dark-skinned bishop from Egypt, North Africa, or Nubia was deemed to be more civilized and possessed of a higher rank than a white slave from the pagan parts of Europe. Discrimination was more likely to be based on religion than skin color, so white Jews or Cathars and other European heretics were likely to have a worse time than non-white Christians. The Middle Ages had strange notions of fair trials. As seen with divorce trials above, people in the Middle Ages had notions of justice that differed greatly from ours. Modern concepts of fair trials, especially the belief in rational adjudication as a means of determining justice, were not widely shared. Back then, trial by ordeal was a common alternative to dispute settlement before a neutral arbiter learned the law to decide the facts of a case and its rights and wrongs of it. The idea was to subject an accused or rival party to a dangerous and painful experience, whose outcome was unknown. Then they would let God decide who was innocent or guilty or right or wrong. Variations included ordeal by water, in which an accused was tied and thrown into a body of water. The accused was deemed innocent if he or she floated and guilty if not. There was also the ordeal by fire, in which an accused held a red-hot bar of iron and walked 3 paces. If the accused's hand healed after 3 days, it was proof of innocence. If not, it was a judgment of guilt for the aristocrats. There was the option of ordeal by combat, with accusers fighting the accused, and victory presumably going to the one in the right. The Middle Ages were pretty rough. The Middle Ages were not a great time to be alive, especially for commoners in feudal Europe. Their society was divided into de facto castes or layers, with peasant serfs and other manual workers, most of the population at the bottom. They were ruthlessly exploited by those in higher layers up the social structure, who benefited from the commoners' labor in exchange for protection. There was a twist though: the protection offered was often from fellow members of the upper castes. Although higher-ups were not as screwed as the commoners at the bottom, life was no bed roses for them. Violence was rife across all classes, even discounting deaths in wars or bullying knights rampaging against peasants. The homicide rate was 50 times greater in medieval Europe than in the modern EU. Put another way, Europeans were 50 times more murderous back then than they are today. However, as seen below, it was not violence, but diseases that did the most to keep life expectancy low. High mortality rates, especially in childhood, kept the average life expectancy around 35 years. A disease that terrified people in the Middle Ages. One of the more colorfully named Middle Ages diseases was St. Anthony's fire, also known as Holy Fire. The affliction was named after the monks of the Order of St. Anthony, who were particularly successful at treating those struck by the disease. Modern medicine, not given to colorful names, knows it as ergotism. It was a horrible illness that produced great suffering caused by fungus that grows on moldy grains, especially rye. St. Anthony's fire produced swelling, redness, and gangrene in those whom it afflicted. A 9th century text described it as, "A great plague of swollen blisters consumed the people by a loathsome rot, so that their limbs were loosened and fell off before death." Sufferers often hallucinated, and sometimes imagined that they were in a fight with Satan. As the disease progressed, convulsions occurred. Extremities began to rot, and ears, fingers, toes, and even arms and legs began to fall off. In 944, about 40,000 died from an outbreak in France. As a contemporary put it, the afflicted thronged to the churches and invoked the saints. The cries of those in pain and the shedding of burned-up limbs alike excited pity. The stench of rotten flesh was unbearable. A plague that gives the Black Death a run for its money in lethality. The Black Death, which devastated the Middle Ages and peaked from 1347 to 1351, was history's deadliest plague. In Europe alone it killed between 1/3 to 2/3 of the population, and it took 2 centuries for the continent to bounce back from that population crash and recover to pre-plague levels. However, Justinian's plague 541 to 542 AD gives it a run for its money in lethality and consequences. It was named after Byzantine Emperor Justinian I, in whose reign it occurred. He came down with it but survived. Justinian's plague swept across 3 continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa, and is thus history's first known recorded pandemic. Like the Black Death, Justinian's plague was caused by the Yersinia pestis, a bacterium with no spores that is still with us today. Also like the Black Death, Justinian's plague struck with a horrific initial outbreak, followed by several recurrences in subsequent years. By the time the Justinian plague died out, it had killed an estimated 25 million to 100 million people. Black rats carried and spread this plague. The strain of bacterium responsible for Justinian's plague, Yersinia pestis, is believed to have originated near the Tian Shan Mountains in Central Asia, along the border between China and Kyrgyzstan. Like the Black Death, Justinian's plague was mainly bubonic and felled its victims with all the bubonic plague's horrors. The pandemic is believed to have first struck China and northern India, made its way via trade routes to the Great Lakes region of Africa, then down the Nile to Egypt. Like the Black Death, Justinian's plague was transmitted by infected fleas carried by black rats. Egypt was the Byzantine Empire's granary, and from its seaports, ships laden with grain and also rats that hosted infected fleas sailed across the Mediterranean. From Egypt the plague rapidly spread to the rest of the Middle East, the Eastern Mediterranean and Constantinople, which served as both capital and commercial center for the Byzantine Empire. From Constantinople the pandemic rapidly spread through the rest of Europe. This plague ushered in the Middle Ages. Europe was struck especially hard by the Justinian plague, and the continent lost an estimated 40 to 50% of its population. The pandemic followed the established trade routes. The outbreak in Constantinople, for example, is believed to have been caused by the arrival of grain ships from Egypt, with black rats and their plague-carrying fleas aboard. Ports and cities were hit particularly hard. The countryside and the parts of Europe off the established trade routes got off relatively light. That lopsided death toll, heavy in the cities and light in the countryside, marked a transitional point for Europe. It ended what was left of the Classical Age and ushered in the feudal era and the Middle Ages. The Classical Age had been marked by a significant urban culture. Justinian's plague on top of Justinian's many wars ended that, devastating the cities and an economy built around the sustainment of urban life. Power centers shifted from cities to the countryside, and rural strongmen emerged as the founders of feudalism. One era and way of life ended, and another began. Not everybody was religious in the Middle Ages. Extremely religious people were common in the Middle Ages, and ranged from those engaged in mass pilgrimages, to flagellants to mystics and saints. However, that does not mean that everybody back then was obsessed with religion, nor does it mean that people back then did not engage in skeptical reflection. There were plenty of ordinary people who did not buy into a variety of common beliefs. They doubted whether saints actually performed miracles, were unsure if the miracle of the Eucharist was real, and questioned whether there really was a resurrection and life after death. Others did not even believe that God had anything to do with nature and the growth of crops and plants. Instead, they attributed such things to simply working and taking care of the soil. Many people sometimes most express their skepticism by simply staying away from church. For example, a Spanish priest wrote his bishop in the early 1300s to complain that hardly anybody bothered to show up for church on Sunday. Instead, people preferred to sleep or lark about on their day of rest. Witch hunts were not a feature of the Middle Ages. A common stereotype about the Middle Ages revolves around the assumption that it was an era of widespread superstition, in which church authorities burned witches left, right and center. While it is true that people in the Middle Ages were quite superstitious, especially when compared to the modern era, their superstitions were not expressed in witch hunts. To be sure, there were some witch trials, but they were relatively rare. When they happened, they were usually done by the secular authorities, and were not directed by the church. Indeed, throughout most of the era, the standard message disseminated by churchmen about magic was that it was silly nonsense that did not work. The European witch craze was more of a 16th and 17th century phenomenon. It kicked off after Heinrich Kramer wrote the infamous Malleus Maleficarum in the late 15th century. In an attempt to convince a skeptical public that witches were real, when it first came out, the church actually condemned the book and warned inquisitors not to believe what it said. A Chinese hero who got anything but his just rewards. Middle Ages Chinese General Yue Fei was one of his country's greatest and most formidable military leaders. In China, he is considered to be the epitome of patriotism and loyal service to the nation, and is viewed today as one of the greatest national folk heroes of Chinese history. During his lifetime, however, Yue Fei was treated quite shabbily by his government. For his heroism, self-sacrifice and devotion to duty, he received shocking ingratitude from his political masters. Yue Fei was born into a poor peasant family, and joined the Song dynasty's military in 1122. From an early age he possessed great power and near supernatural strength, which made him a formidable warrior. He rose to prominence amidst a war against the nomadic Jurchen tribes who invaded and overran northern China in 1126. The Jurchens captured the Song capital of Kaifeng, along with the emperor and his father. The emperor's brother fled to southern China, where he re-established the dynasty, known thereafter as the Southern Song, and was declared the Zhejiang Emperor. A pretty raw deal for a savior of his country. After the Jurchen overran northern China, Yue Fei accompanied the Zhejiang Emperor in his flight to the south, and assumed military command of the remnants of the Song forces. He defeated the pursuing Jurchens, and kept them from further advances into China. However, his efforts to recover the northern territories were foiled by a powerful peace faction that balked at the expense of continuing the war. He was poised with his armies to recapture the lost Song capital of Kaifeng, when courtiers advised the Zhejiang Emperor to recall him and open peace negotiations with the Jurchens. The Zhejiang Emperor worried that a final victory over the Jurchen would end with the release of his captive brother, the previous Song Emperor who had been taken prisoner, as that would threaten his own claim to the throne. The emperor accepted his courtiers' advice and recalled Yue Fei to the capital in 1141. That one of China's most brilliant generals was imprisoned and eventually executed on trumped-up charges in 1142. Ironically, Yue Fei had tattooed on his back the phrase, "of the country with the utmost loyalty." The Middle Ages' most stigmatized illness. The Middle Ages were rife with contagious diseases, but cities were especially vulnerable. Between poor sanitation, lack of adequate hygiene, and overcrowding, urban dwellers were most at risk from contagions than swept through with great speed. Such health risk factors made the era quite dangerous, especially for city people. Add mediocre standards of medical care and knowledge, and it is unsurprising that life expectancy back then was abysmally low. Among the worst diseases was leprosy, which devastated sufferers' health as well as their social status. A little misunderstood disease even today, leprosy carried a huge stigma in the Middle Ages. Lepers were shunned and cast not just out of cities, but from even the smallest hamlets. The stigma did not end with death, but carried through into the afterlife, as lepers were denied burial alongside non-lepers, mostly thanks to Leviticus 13:44-46, which states, "He is leprous, he is unclean. The priest shall pronounce him unclean, the disease is on his head. The person who has the leprous disease shall wear torn clothes, and let the hair of his head be disheveled, and he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, Unclean, unclean. He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean, he shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp." The man who conquered Spain for the Islamic world. Middle Ages General Tariq ibn Ziyad, died circa 720, was a Berber who led the Muslim conquest of Visigothic Hispania, today's Iberian Peninsula. He was a trusted slave of North Africa's Muslim governor, Musa bin Nusayr, who appointed Tariq governor of Tangier in 710. There he was approached by a Visigoth nobleman from nearby Ceuta, incensed and out for revenge because the Visigoth king Roderick had raped his daughter. He allied with Tariq, and arranged to ship him and a small army of about 7,000 men to Hispania. Tariq crossed from North Africa into Spain in 711, there he established a beachhead in today's Gibraltar, a Spanish derivation of Jabal Tariq or Mount of Tariq, which is named after him. After he secured Gibraltar, Tariq reportedly burned his fleet to drive home to his men that there was no possibility of retreat, and that the choices before them were either victory or death. Then from Gibraltar as a base of operations, Tariq proceeded to subjugate the territory of today's Spain and Portugal, which he sought to conquer on behalf of the Umayyad Caliphate. Instead of getting rewarded for his great deeds, this general was punished and ended his life as a beggar. Tariq ibn Ziyad eventually met and fought a Visigoth army about 3 times bigger than his own, at the Battle of Guadalete in 712. He won a complete victory, in which the Visigoth king and much of the Visigoth nobility were slain. Tariq then proceeded to capture the Visigoth capital city of Toledo. He next split his small army into smaller divisions, conducted a lightning campaign against the demoralized Visigoths, and captured many of their major cities, such as Granada, Córdoba, and Guadalajara. Tariq then governed Hispania until the arrival of his master, Musa, a year later. However, Musa was reportedly envious of his slave's stunning accomplishments. In one of the Middle Ages' greatest acts of ingratitude, rather than reward Tariq, Musa put him in chains and had him tortured. In 714, the Umayyad Caliph summoned Musa and Tariq to his capital, Damascus, to report on the conquest and address accusations of corruption. Upon arrival at the Caliph's court, Musa sought to claim the lion's share of the credit for the conquest. Tariq, however, successfully refuted his master's claims with evidence that Musa was in North Africa while Tariq was defeating and conquering the Visigoths. Discredited, Musa was eventually convicted of corruption and imprisoned. Tariq avoided prison, but was stripped of all titles and ranks. Despite the immense riches his conquest of the Iberian Peninsula had gained for the Umayyad Caliphate, Tariq died in dire poverty, reportedly reduced to begging for alms outside mosques. A strange sickness that mysteriously appeared, then vanished. A new disease is known as the sweating sickness suddenly appeared in the late Middle Ages, with the first appearance in England, after which it spread to continental Europe, a mysterious illness. The sweating sickness struck in epidemic waves over a 7-decade period, then vanished just as suddenly as it had emerged. Little is known about the incubation period, but when the symptoms cropped up, they and their consequences were sudden, and usually devastating. Death frequently occurred within just a few hours. Initial symptoms included a sense of dread, followed by shivering, headaches, giddiness, exhaustion, nausea, and severe pains in the neck, back, shoulders, and limbs. Then came the symptom that gave the disease its name, copious sweat, that was often accompanied by abdominal pains and delirium. Severe symptoms typically lasted for 15 to 21 hours, and often culminated in a coma or death. Unusual among illnesses, the sweating sickness disproportionately struck the upper classes. Today, various theories ascribe the mysterious disease to hantavirus influenza, typhus, or botulism. However, there is no definitive answer yet as to just what the sweating sickness might have been. The Middle Ages' greatest conqueror was bad for people, but good for the environment. In 1206, after a series of bloody wars on the eastern steppe, a nomad leader named Temujin united the tribes of Mongolia under his rule. He then got himself declared Chinggis Khan, or universal ruler, and set out on what his shamans declared was a divinely mandated mission of global conquest. He didn't conquer the globe, but he and his successors created the world's biggest empire until then. It still remains history's largest contiguous land empire, and is second in landmass only to the British Empire. In addition to the creation of a massive Middle Ages empire, the Mongol invasions kicked off by Chinggis Khan had another global impact that was only recently examined. Per research by the Carnegie Institution's Department of Global Ecology, the great Mongol warlord actually cooled the planet. Not that such was his goal, or that he or anybody else back then had any notion about global warming or cooling or carbon emissions. Nonetheless, as seen below, that is just what he did. Genghis Khan lowered carbon emissions in the bloodiest way possible. In a nutshell, Genghis Khan's Mongol conquest cooled Earth, because so many people were killed that it resulted in reforestation, as the author of the study that examined that put it. It's a common misconception that the human impact on climate began with the large-scale burning of coal and oil in the industrial era. Actually, humans started to influence the environment thousands of years ago by changing the vegetation cover of the Earth's landscapes when we cleared forests for agriculture. The Mongol invasions that swept across Asia, the Middle East, Russia and into Central Europe killed an estimated 40 million people. That was in a world whose population was about 400 million, or roughly a 20th of the one we live in today. If extrapolated to modern population figures, it would be the equivalent of almost 800 million deaths today, or more than 8 times the deaths of World Wars I and II combined. That massive body count meant there were significantly fewer people to engage in activities that emitted carbon. Many regions were depopulated, and vast swathes of what had once been cleared and cultivated fields reverted to forests whose trees and vegetation absorbed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Mother Nature barely noticed the Black Death, but it noticed Genghis Khan's massacres. Scholars, who published their study in the Holocene in 2011, began their research with a global model of land cover in 800 AD. And they examined 4 major historical events that could have impacted the climate because of reforestation after significant population declines. Those were the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, the Black Death in the 14th century, the conquest of the Americas in the 16th and 17th centuries, and the fall of Ming China in the 17th century. All of these events caused massive fatalities. The Black Death, for example, killed over 25 million people. However, the only one of those calamities noticed by Mother Nature was the Mongol invasions. Genghis Khan's depredations reduced global CO2 by about 0.1 part per million. It was a minor, but nonetheless noticeable and measurable effect. As one researcher explained, that was because the Mongol invasions had the greatest impact on the amount of land covered by vegetation. We found that during the short events such as the Black Death and the Ming Dynasty collapse, the forest regrowth wasn't enough to overcome the emissions from decaying material in the soil, but during the longer-lasting ones like the Mongol invasion and the conquest of the Americas, there was enough time for the forest to regrow and absorb significant amounts of carbon.